Hi, my name is Mackenzie Osborne and I'm a senior psychology student at the University of South Florida. Today, I'm going to be talking about rumination and how you can control your own internal conflict. So, do you control your thoughts, or do your thoughts control you? Specifically, I'm speaking of rumination. However, first, a word from our sponsor, regret. Now, regret is a totally universal concept. When I say the word regret, something springs up in each and every individual's mind, whether it be the Webster's definition or a particularly unpleasant experience that you had in your previous life. I used to think that regret was not real. I used to pontificate and think, well, why would people have regrets? Because whoever you are in that moment came from all the mistakes that you have made. And according to Dr. Melanie Greenberg's 2012 research, not only is regret real, but there's a distinction between young regret and old regret. And by that, it's the degree of severity experienced by each demographic. Specifically, young regret might be an emotional, a negative emotional experience that youth will feel when thinking of the regret. However, as you get older, those regrets tend to build anxiety as you logically realize that time to fix these things is starting to run out because you're ending in your life's development. Dr. Susan Nolan Homsema, she actually did a lot of research before she passed away in 2013, specifically connecting regret and rumination, and she says that regret is, of course, a negative cognitive emotional state in which one beats themselves up for their past actions. So when one is thinking in a regretful capacity, i.e. ruminating, this tends to lead to extreme amounts of depression. So what is rumination? Rumination is essentially, well, really, it's derived from the term for ruminant animals. See, there is this whole rumen in the digestive system of cows and goats and sheep, and what they do to break down that plant matter is they chew up the plant matter, it goes into the rumen, and then they regurgitate it up to continuously chew on it until it is all broken down and it can pass through their system. Humans don't, of course, regurgitate plant matter that they're trying to eat. Instead, we seem to compulsively regurgitate thoughts and feelings, generally in a negative way. Rumination takes its toll on physiological systems, such as physical health. There's an increase in blood pressure, an increase in heart rate, and there's actually a longer physiological recovery from stress. Another way that it affects people is through their mental health. It ramps up brain activity and it floods your brain with the stress hormone cortisol. Also, it's the number one driver of clinical depression. Risky behaviors exhibiting when one tends to ruminate include binge eating, over drinking, insomnia, and there's that word depression in there again. So the question is, why do people ruminate? Well, it's because there's this tendency to believe that if you think about something long enough, you're actually going to come up with a solution. Do you believe that? Lord knows I did. However, the science says no, right? You have psychologists' research indicating that overthinking drains your energy resources, which means there's no problem solving occurring whatsoever, right? And then psychologist Michael Yapko says if a solution essentially does not come up and it leads you to timely action, then that is the process in which you begin to ruminate or regurgitate those feelings and emotions, bringing you down. Some biological influences on rumination that you probably aren't even aware of are included with the default mode network, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And these are all brain systems, and the brain is obviously a very complicated organ. I'm just going to touch on these three systems and how they contribute to the development of the tendency to ruminate. The first one I want to talk about is the default mode network. So, here we have the salience network. Now, the salience network is essentially a filter, and it filters out all of this excess stimuli, right? Between noises and sensations and lights and everything else, it's always filtering out excess stimuli to see what can you really pay attention to. And from there, you go to the central executive network, which is when your brain is accomplishing tasks, right? It's doing things. Now, the default mode network is essentially the screensaver of the brain. We have this tendency in our brain to, when we're daydreaming, that's essentially the default mode network. And that it's very self-centered. You usually think about family and friends and tasks that you need to accomplish when you're just letting your mind wander. Well, during this period, your brain is in the screensaver mode, essentially processing everything that's going around passively while still waiting for a threat to survival to instantaneously come out and grab you, right? So that's the purpose of the default mode network, is to keep you aware, but you're not telling your brain to actually do anything. Screensaver. Now, when we talk about survival instinct, you have the amygdala. The amygdala, right here, is the oldest part of the brain. They call it the lizard brain. It's the least evolved part of the brain. And it has to do with positive stimulus experience. So it has a reward system as well, but really conceptually its purpose is to survive. So it stores all of your memories of fearful things so that you don't do it again. Like, you know, fire is hot and you can't breathe underwater and saber-tooth tigers are bad, right? The amygdala stores all of those fear memories inside of it. And it will go into the hippocampus. It will stimulate the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your brain that not only helps you figure out what you want to pay attention to in terms of stimulus response, it also is in charge of your memory. And there are times when the amygdala, with its stress hormone, triggers the hippocampus, and the hippocampus recognizes the instinctual fear, but then the hippocampus remembers, right? Remembers personal things that has happened to you to emulate that fear, and then your hippocampus will give you kind of false memories in order to conceptualize really conceptualize contextual memory, right? So it basically, your amygdala triggers the fear response and your hippocampus makes you think of something that you did fear to give that fear context. So then that emotion becomes real. There are some things really interesting about the hippocampus. Your memory is totally not reliable because there are a lot of things that get lost in translation between short-term and long-term memory. So you have to remember that when you have this fear response, it may not even be real. Your hippocampus is trying to fill in the blank as to why your amygdala is stimulated in a fearful way. So let's put this information together. The default mode network kicks on as your mind starts to wander. The amygdala is stimulated during the default mode network because its job is to lie in wait for the next threat to survival, and then that fear will trigger the hippocampus. The hippocampus comes alive and fills in the blanks as to why you're afraid. What made you afraid? Bloop! Your hippocampus is like roller coasters or bears or whatever, right? So these three things can work together to create the mindset in which people can get stuck in the process of rumination. What does it all mean? Well, it means that it's totally possible to identify your own negative thoughts and control yourself. And that is what this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is specifically for. Now, the prefrontal cortex is this really cool part of our brain that mammals have that's uber evolved and super developed, and it gives us the ability to reason. It gives us the ability to have choice. It's in charge of behavior regulation and personality exhibition, and that all comes from choosing, right? You cannot regulate your behavior if you have no choice to do so. It's not instinctual. And the prefrontal cortex is really what brought mammals. It's one of the huge things that separates mammals from, let's say, reptiles. You know, it's a specific choice of mammals to love. Love is not something that you choose only for survival. Of course, unless you're an evolutionary psychologist and then they get into all that. But the point is, overall, is that we actively choose to love. We don't save our offspring simply because we're trying to preserve our own genetic makeup to pass on to future generations. We do it because we actively love our children. So this means that we can also actively choose to not get stuck down the rabbit hole of negative rumination. Here are some strategies on how to control negative thoughts and not let them control you. Clinical psychologist Steve Airdy says the first step to eliminating rumination is recognition. So you have to recognize the fact that you're doing it. If you're in a negative thought process, you need to take a step back, be objective, and say, do I feel overwhelmed? Am I obsessing a little bit? If the answer is yes, then you really need to stop. You just need to stop yourself and realize that you're getting a little crazy for no reason, right? We got psychologist suggestions, and they suggest reading a book, going for a walk, talking to a friend, listening to music, and other activities that are going to distract you from that negative thought process. There's a cognitive behavior therapy technique called thought stopping. And the idea here is that once you recognize that you have a negative thought, you stop it in its tracks and you analyze it a little bit. You become objective. Is there any real evidence to support your negative emotion? Or are you just making a mountain out of a molehill? Another suggestion is to capture your thought, which means recognize it, right? And you write it down, and in the words of Elsa, you let it go. Oh, and then Dr. Harry Croft, he says to be super objective and imagine that your friend is telling you this negative thought. How would you respond to your friend? Would you beat them up, right? Or would you be compassionate? And that's the whole idea here, is that you're compassionate to yourself. Oh, some things to keep in mind when you're experiencing regret and rumination is don't beat yourself up, right? Everybody goes down the rabbit hole and it's totally okay. Just try to crawl back out of it without freaking out. Yay. Also, your hippocampus is fallible. There's not a lot of reason, you know what I mean, like logical reason. There's not a lot of logical reasoning going on if, let's say that the memory you're so upset about, the thing you're ruminating on, maybe it didn't really even happen that way. Since the hippocampus is fallible, since your memory is fallible, all humans' memories are fallible, don't dwell so much on things that maybe didn't even happen from your perception, right? Also, you're a mammal, you got a prefrontal cortex, so you can choose to be negative or not. You can choose to use logic and reason to take a step back and to stop this pattern of negative rumination. So, in conclusion, ladies and jellyfish, with this information, you can control your thoughts and by extension your own negativity and hopefully make the world a better place, one brain at a time. The more you know. Live long and prosper, dudes. Thank you so much. I hope you take care. Bye.